And
No, it doesn't help going quicker. All right, we've had some internet problems here, so hopefully we've tried to eliminate. Yeah, okay, it's running properly. All right. Anyway, welcome. We're going straight into what we need to do today. We're in the very last, we kind of summarizing Galatians and Thessalonians, First Thessalonians. But today we also, as promised last week, we're going to be looking at Second Thessalonians and why scholars believe that it wasn't actually written by Paul. Right? So whether it was or wasn't, it's disputed. So in order for us to be safe in understanding what Paul actually taught, we leave it out, right? And one of the reasons why it's disputed as one of Paul's letters, especially one of Paul's early letters, is because of the tension between 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians, theological tension. But when you're in theological tension with 1 Thessalonians, the question is it also, is 2 Thessalonians also in tension with the other early letters, Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Romans, and Philippians and Philemon. So this morning I woke up very early and I read through all of them again. Like I read through all 7 letters again this morning, and it does seem to be quite it seemed to be quite obvious to me that 2 Thessalonians is like it sticks out like a sore thumb, they say. And we're going to be talking about some of that today. I've never spoken about this publicly, so this is it's going to be quite an interesting morning for me, and we've had to overcome a couple of hurdles on our way here today. All right, so just a very quick recap on the ideas we find in Galatians and First Thessalonians. As far as we know, the 2 earliest books written by Paul, which also makes it the 2 earliest books in our New Testament, right? So one of the things that we're going to draw attention to today is that in the very beginning of Galatians, one of the major themes of Galatians is Paul writing against false gospels. So as early as this time, which we estimate to be about 20 years after Jesus's ascension, there was a awareness by Paul that there were people going around preaching a different gospel, right, in the church. So I think this is one of the things we just need to make peace with, that the church did not start with everyone believing the same thing. It took us hundreds of years to get to a place where we forced everyone to accept this view. If you don't, you're a heretic and we don't want anything to do with you. But in the very early days, there were multiple streams. We know that from history. And we have evidence of it very early on in the earliest writings of Paul, that there were some other people, some would say other apostles, going around saying things that Paul was completely unhappy with. And if you're a Christian, a modern day Christian today, it seems like Paul's view won at the end. And so your bias would be that whatever anybody else said is wrong because Paul is right? That's how we tend to think. Yeah. But we need to be a little bit more open-minded and realize that even the very early things that Paul spoke about, we don't no longer hold on to it. We have different views today. So let's just go through Galatians and Thessalonians in a very, very brief way. Some of the keynotes from these books is, number one, the recognition that there are some false gospels. Secondly, in the book of Galatians is a strong anti-Jewish religion or Torah sentiment from Paul's side, kind of telling us to leave it behind and move on. Then there's a very strong theme about the justification through the faithfulness or the faith of Jesus. And then there's something which you find in all Paul's letters, and this is something I must say, if you read through these 7 undisputed letters of Paul, love is center. Paul always ends in love, and it really does feel to me that when you read through these 7 letters, everything feels like it's written in love. When I read 2 Thessalonians, I don't get that feeling. This is my own little 2 cents. It's so harsh. It's so sectarian. It doesn't feel like...
No, it's not the same flavor.
It doesn't feel like the same flavor. Even when Paul writes really hard things and when he is trying to correct people like in Corinthians, it just always feels like there's a father's heart behind it. And that love always seems to sit centrally, and I think Galatians is a good example of that. First Thessalonians is another good example of them, but then of course we have books like First Corinthians, which is 1 Corinthians 13, where he kind of defines what he believes by this love. So it seems to me like Galatians and Thessalonians has love as the spirit of love that now works in us and stands in opposition to the spirit of selfishness or the works of the flesh, or if you want to call it your biology, the things you truly want to do, your selfishness, right? Then there's the theme of the coming of Jesus and the inheritance of the kingdom, which in Galatians seems to be, the kingdom seems to be equated to the idea of a new creation. We've said much about Paul's expectation, which seems to be for us to be a typical Jewish Pharisaical expectation, which is an apocalyptic one. It was the end of the age, of this horrible, evil age, and a new, beautiful age was about to dawn. And Jesus was the one that was coming again to come and make this happen. This seems to be Paul's expectation. In the book of Galatians, one of the aspects of love is when people fall in and believe the wrong things, you have to carry their burdens, help them in love, in the spirit of love, and always in the spirit of love. First Thessalonians seems to be a very good complementary book to Galatians, to me at least. Once again, the coming of Jesus is central. It's at the end of at the end of every chapter, there's some form of reference to the hope of the coming of Jesus, right? And sandwiched in between there's always this idea of, but while we wait, we need to love one another, we need to grow in love, etc. Paul mentions a tribulation, which he believes he is already in. And then the other thing we really pick up from the book of First Thessalonians is an imminent, and we'll also find that in books like Philippians and in Corinthians, that Paul really had an imminent expectation, or an expectation of the imminent coming of Jesus. We'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then also this idea of kingdom and glory seems to be something Paul is looking forward to, this new life. And then the question in 1 Thessalonians, of course, is what about those who have now died? How are they going to partake in this kingdom? And this is where the idea of the resurrection comes to the front, more explicitly mentioned in the book of Corinthians, but here in 1 Thessalonians, simply just don't worry, those who have died, first, they will rise from the dead, and then together with us, we'll meet the Lord in the air, and so we'll be forever with him. So as we said earlier on, it's not really the idea of the rapture going on here, but more the caught up in the air is more an idea of bringing Jesus into the earth, meeting him, and coming and reigning and ruling on the earth. And then there's also a very important theme, which is the theme of salvation versus the wrath. And so what we need to say is important, that Paul, nowhere in early Paul do we really see Paul saying or thinking that when you die, you go to heaven. It's more an idea of when you die, you're dead and you sleep. When Jesus comes, you are resurrected. That's the salvation Paul speaks. Paul's salvation is not a dying and going to heaven here in the early books. It's when Jesus comes, you will inherit this amazing kingdom that's going to be on earth. The opposite of that is when Jesus comes, you'll be judged. Right? So that's the idea of salvation versus wrath, which is played off. There's a tension between those two. And it seems to me like Paul believed that there were some were going to be saved and some that weren't. That seems to be the obvious direction we're moving in here. So one of the things that's conspicuously absent in these early books is the idea of heaven and hell. Paul doesn't really use the idea of hell too much. And also not the idea of heaven. When he does speak of heaven, it's his expectation of Jesus that comes from heaven, that we are expecting something from heaven, but it comes to earth and it does whatever it does here on earth. Okay, so let's move on to today's topic, which is the book of Thessalonians. And obviously we can't read through all of it today. More or less, scholars estimate that the book of Thessalonians, the second book, was written about 50 years after the first one. So it's quite a long time. Excuse me. Paul dies about 15 years after his first or early books. He dies in about 65 AD. The early books of Paul written between 50 and 60 AD, and most scholars agree that Thessalonians was written close to the 100s. So we're talking about a book that's written quite a lot later. And what we want to talk about today is the reasons why they believe that this book was written so much later. Okay, so I'm going to do a bit of a summary. This is not just word for word what I read on and studied. This is also just from from reading them together, reading Second Thessalonians, or maybe you'd want to do the exercise, read the other 7 books of Paul, and then go read Thessalonians, and you'll find unique material in there that you're not really going to find anywhere else. And unique writing style, that I'm not a linguist, so I can't sit here and say the Greek formations are different in Second Thessalonians than 1 Thessalonians, but it seems like scholars do believe that it is written in a different style. But the most important thing, and we'll get to that last, is the theological changes in the book of Second Thessalonians. And so, yeah, there is the argument that, of course, Paul could have changed his view, but then we would have seen those changes also in books like Romans and First Corinthians, and it just doesn't seem like it. It seems like 1 and 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, they agree with Galatians and First Thessalonians. So that puts Second Thessalonians in a very odd space. And there's some really odd things going on in Second Thessalonians, which I'm going to try my best to highlight today. Maybe you've never given any notice to some of these things, because they almost just read over it. Yeah, okay, sure, fine, let's move on. All right, so the first thing I'd like to say that I personally pick up from Second Thessalonians is its harshness. It seems to me like Paul in his other books, although he was expecting a wrath to come, and he most certainly believed that people were going to be given judgment or punishment according to what they have done. In Second Thessalonians, it's just over the top. Like, it almost takes the place of love. There's also very little about love. I think it's maybe mentioned once. The rest of it sounds like this, and I'll just read you some of it. 2 Thessalonians 1:6, righteousness is a good response, recompense. It is a righteous thing to recompense the tribulation. In other words, the writer here is saying it's a good thing that God will give judgment to those who are causing us pain. Right, that's the one thing. And 2 Thessalonians 1 verse 8, a flaming fire that takes vengeance on those who do not know God. It's vengeful. You don't get a vengeful idea from the rest of Paul's writings. This is almost like, we'll get you for what you've done. That's the feeling I get. Punishment with everlasting destruction we get in 1 verse 9. In 2 verse 12, those who do not believe the truth are damned. Like, it doesn't feel like 1 Thessalonians. It doesn't feel like Galatians. It feels overly harsh. That's the first thing that you pick up. The second thing we pick up from here is it's not the theme of let's carry one another's burdens and help one another, right? It's a sectarian feel of get rid of those who think differently than you, right? Let me just quickly have a look. So one of the main things in here, and we'll get to it a little bit more later, is that there has to come like what Paul calls a falling away. In other words, the writer calls a falling away. So in this whole 2 Thessalonians, there's the feeling of there's people in the church that don't belong there. They believe the wrong things, they do the right things, and Jesus can't come until there's this separation between the good people and the bad people in the church. You don't get that idea from the other writings of Paul. There it's more a help one another right in the spirit of love. Those who are mature help one another right. Here it's and we'll talk about the timing in a moment, but here it's more of there has to come now a separation. He calls it a falling away, and he calls it the son of perdition that sits in the temple. The word Greekly is naos, and it means like a spiritual temple. In other words, kind of like the church. They're in with us, but they're not from us. They need to go out, right? And there has to be, in 2 verse 8, there has to be a revealing of this wickedness inside of the group, and they have to be destroyed, right? And then Paul would write things like, you have to withdraw from people who are disorderly, and keep no company with those who don't obey this letter. Okay, so there's this, I just call the sectarian flavor to this, where there's a lot of separation that has to take place. Now it's no longer an imminent coming, it's now, guys, it can't happen, don't worry. It can't happen until this thing has happened. We don't find this in the other writings of Paul, that there's no man of sin, separation, this type of idea that is prominent in Paul's other writings. In the other writings, it's more, if you go to the books of Corinthians and to Romans, you start feeling like Paul is a universalist, like he's including the whole of humanity in this salvation. which in 2 Thessalonians, it feels sectarian. That's the
Yeah.
feeling I get from it, right? Okay. So also what you don't get in 2 Thessalonians, which you do get in the other books of Paul, is you don't get any negative sentiments about the Torah and the Jewish religion. It's not there. Okay? So that's interesting, at least. But the main reason, one of the two main reasons why scholars don't believe that this book was written by Paul is the idea that in the book of Thessalonians, in 2 Thessalonians, the writer says the following. He says, and actually maybe I should just read it for you quickly, and I want you to listen carefully to what is said here. He says, now we beseech you, brothers, the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and by our gathering together unto him. So he sets the topic, which is the topic of 1 Thessalonians. Now he says this, that you should not be soon shaken in mind, or be troubled, neither by spirit, nor by word, nor by a letter as from us, as that the day of Christ is at hand. Okay, there's a lot to be said here. The first thing is, he says, don't worry, the coming of Jesus is not at hand. Okay, so this is a problem, because in the other letters, early letters of Paul, it seems to be obvious. I mean, I've written down a little, some of them even from Corinthians, and where's that one? Here we go. In Philippians 4 verse 5, he explicitly says the Lord is at hand. You know, these type of things. 1 Corinthians 15:51, we shall not all sleep. In other words, some of us here will not die. 2 Corinthians 6:2, now is the day of salvation. In proper context of what salvation is, now is the day. Thief in the night, the unexpected.
Yeah.
But don't worry, tonight when it happens, you know, we'll be all right. It just seems to be a contradiction of what is said in the other early books of Paul, where it seems that Paul says imminent coming, and this book says, not only does it say, and this is very important, not only does it say, don't worry, it's not at hand, it also says, as if we wrote a letter that says that it is. So what's actually going on here, let me just read that little portion, because it's easy to read over it. Don't be shaken, not in word, nor by letter as from us, that the day of Christ is at hand. But that's what 1 Thessalonians is. It's a letter by Paul that tries to convey the message, it's at hand. If you read the other books of Paul, Paul will say, don't even marry. If you have to, okay. If you're burning, all right. But it's not that important. Because it's at hand, the Lord is at hand. So 2 Thessalonians seems to scholars to be almost like a rebuttal or a correction of 1 Thessalonians. And what they estimate is this, that because it's written 50 years later, Jesus never came in Paul's time, right? Now it's, let's say, the 100 AD. Now it's 65 years after Jesus' ascension. He still hasn't come in the way that Paul wrote. The church is asking questions. What's going on, Pastor? Paul wrote here, this is it, So somebody, and this is why most scholars call these books pseudepigrapha, which meaning it's written in the name of Paul, but not by Paul. Possibly a later scholar of Paul, a disciple of Paul, trying to bring correction in some way, trying to say, but Paul actually believed that it wasn't that close, and we misunderstood what he said, and writes this in the name of Paul to put the church at ease, so that they know, hey, look, we're still waiting for this falling away that has to happen at the church, and this hasn't happened yet. So relax, guys. Stop asking questions. So it's not written maliciously, but it is written as a form of a rebuttal or a correction of 1 Thessalonians, to try and put people at ease that don't worry, we know Jesus hasn't come, we know it's been 65 years, Paul is dead, long gone. So someone writes this much later in the name of Paul. It's found, and later in the Christian tradition, it's accepted that Paul wrote it. Now, we, of course, as Christians, we accept this letter as by Paul for most of our lives. I did, because I just believed the tradition that was handed to me. And it's only once I did some investigation, I started reading beyond apologists, I started reading scholars of the New Testament, that it seems to me to be very probable that this was not written by Paul, but this is an apology. It's an apologetic to some degree, saying, don't worry, Jesus is still coming, but we're still waiting for this thing. And this thing, Paul doesn't write about anyway. So what is a little bit worrying is that the writers of 2 Thessalonians, they say, it's not as innocent as saying, Paul got it slightly wrong, or we have to move on a little bit. They actually say, there's a letter going around that says it's at hand. That's not us. That's the problem with this book. Why is it like that? Why does it feel like
It's the same author.
he puts himself in tension? So it almost feels to you like, okay, wait a minute, then maybe 1 Thessalonians wasn't Paul. But the fact that 1 Thessalonians fits with Galatians and 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans shows us which one is the odd out. If those books had this idea of a falling away in the man of sin, the man of lawlessness inside the temple has to be separated, then we could argue and say maybe 1 Thessalonians wasn't written by Paul. But one of these wasn't written by Paul.
And this is the odd one
And
out.
it seems like this one is the odd one out. And it makes a lot of sense that this is also, in the larger scheme of things, it's an apologetic as to why Jesus didn't come in Paul's time, or just simply, it's been 65 years. The new creation has not arrived. We're still all dying. We're sick. We're suffering. Many of us are still persecuted. What's going on? All right. So this is the main thing. That is the idea that 2 Thessalonians asking people not to be deceived by another letter that says it's at hand. It can't be at hand because of the falling away that must happen first. And then he goes one step further, and it gets stranger and odder as you spend some time thinking about this, not just reading it through, right? Verse 5 says the following. It says, don't you remember when I was with you? I told you these things. So now this writer is saying, look, when I was actually with you, I told you about the falling away and that it's not at hand. Now you're thinking, so who wrote 1 Thessalonians that made no mention of the falling away? Surely, if it was Paul that was with him, he would have in 1 Thessalonians already wrote about, hey, it's not at hand. Hold on, boys. It's going to be a while because of the falling away. Why is the second letter saying that when he was there, he already told them, but his first letter doesn't have it in it? So this puts these two books really, truly at odds with one another, and the logic brings you to a place where it becomes very hard to argue that they're both written by Paul.
Yeah.
Very hard to argue. It gets weirder though. It gets a little bit weirder than that. So he says, hey, why can't you remember all these things? And the weirdest part about the whole book is at the end of the book, the writer again makes an emphatic statement where Paul doesn't make anywhere else, saying, you see, this is a letter written by me, Paul, because like I did in every other book, I ended in my own handwriting. That's a paraphrase. No other book of Paul makes claims like that. It's the only book of the early writings of Paul that says, hey, this is not a forgery. There's another forgery out there, but this is not a forgery, and this is how I prove it. I'm writing this in my own handwriting, which is the way I end every single one of my books. Right, so now the author goes even beyond and says, I'm proving to you now that this is not somebody else. This truly is Paul, which makes the author stand out even more as a sore thumb, because Paul never did any of that. So the only book that comes close to that type of ending is 1 Corinthians, but all the other ones make no mention of, I'm writing this in my own name so you'll know that it's me. Some scholars say that this is an obvious sign that this is a guy that's not Paul, that's writing, trying to convince people that he is Paul, trying to write an apologetic for why Jesus had not come yet. So obviously 2 Thessalonians, and I mean you can go read the rest of it, but it stands in contrast to not only Galatians and First Thessalonians, but also to the other early books. Let me go just through some of the notes I've got here. So it seems to be clear for us that from the other books, Paul expected this to happen in his own time. He believed that he would be there. Others would sleep, but he'd be changed in the twinkling of an eye. It's like a thief in the night. It's unexpected and imminent, right? The day of the Lord is at hand. We will not sleep. Now is the day of salvation. So Philippians 4 verse 1 is one of the interesting ones where he actually makes the emphatic statement. The Lord is at hand. And that is a contradiction to what 2 Thessalonians says. Don't be deceived. As you've read in other letters, the Lord is not at hand. That's a contradiction.
Yeah.
And we need to think about why is that so? And that's what puts 2 Thessalonians on a little bit of an island on its own. That scholars who approach the Bible from a more neutral perspective can read these things for what they say. As a Christian, it's really hard.
Yeah.
It's taken me a very long time to get to this point. Because as a Christian, you just accept everything that's in the Bible as if God wrote it himself. And he did not. And in fact, there are more than one books in the New Testament that are not written by the people that claim to write them. And it wasn't necessarily malicious intent, but in some people would argue it's a continuation of the teaching of someone. It was a practice they had to write in the name of their teacher. Fine. But when we come to a place where we really have contradiction here going on, and we see almost the adaptation of the theology to fit the time, which is actually how theology works. All written theology is the adaptation of earlier theology to fit with the time. And it seems like 2 Thessalonians is that by the time the church got to around the end of the first century, Jesus still hadn't come in the way that the apocalyptic expectation was of a new heaven and earth. You can spiritualize that. I'm not doing that today. It didn't come in the physical sense that the Jews were, that the Jewish expectation in the way that it looked, and there was apologetics needed. And it seems like 2 Thessalonians is that apologetic, but it goes just that one step further than apologetic and says, don't be deceived by the other letters that says it is at hand. I mean, that's a lot of Paul's letters. And it goes as far as to say, I was there with you and I told you about this. But he doesn't write about it when the first book as he comes away from there. And then lastly, this really odd statement at the end where he tries to prove that he truly is Paul, which you don't find in any other Paul's writing. Okay, so those are the very obvious, the very simple reasons. There are other reasons, linguistic reasons, the actual writing style, which linguists can decipher and look at if you can read and understand Greek. It's obvious that to them that this book is not written by Paul. Okay. The other thing that you do pick up in 2 Thessalonians is that the writer of this Thessalonians says, and this seems to fall into this narrative I've just explained to you. Here he doesn't, there's no urgency about this coming. He's actually trying to tell people, hey, please go work. Please get back into work. Those who don't work are not going to eat. Because you know what happens when you have an imminent expectation. Like, I mean, even in my parents' generation, they were told not to marry and not to go study because it's imminent, right? I mean, 2,000 years later, how much more in those moments people just said, hey, we're just going to love one another, sit around and wait because it's any moment, Thursday or next Thursday. And so 65 years later, 2 Thessalonians says, please, for heaven's sake, if you don't work, you're not going to eat. Go and work. It's not at hand. Don't be deceived, etc. Okay. One of the things that's glaringly obvious from Galatians and 2 Thessalonians, and I mentioned that earlier, is that the writers acknowledge that there are falsehoods out there already. And that if you don't take anything that I've said here, you don't accept anything, that's fine. But you can't argue with the fact that they both acknowledge that at this early time, Galatians really early, Thessalonians first, 2 Thessalonians, if you believe it was early, the 50s, if you believe it was late, the 100s, forgeries are already there, people deceiving other people, writing in other people's names. This is the reality of life. This is the reality of writing during this time. And that alone should tell you, I need to be careful to think about what is real and what isn't. And the reality that many of us don't really ever face and we don't think about too much is that what eventually ended up in our library, our Bible, was the decision of men. They decided, we don't think this is real, we think this is pseudepigrapha, we think this should be left out. These are the ones that are real. And they just didn't have the tools we have today, the linguistic tools. Anyway. Critical scholarship really didn't exist back then. So we just accepted whatever was given to us, and because it's in the Bible, boom, there it is. If it's in the Bible and it says Paul wrote it, that has to be like that because God said it. And that's just not how the Bible works, sorry. So another contrast with 2 Thessalonians is this idea that I just feel like it's not written in love. It just doesn't feel like it's written in love like all Paul's other letters, and I'm not sure what scholars say about that. That's my little 2 cents. So to end off today, and this will end off Galatians and Thessalonians, which really are I would say the pillars of early Pauline theology, and we will move on next week to the next early Paul book of Paul. I'm not sure which one yet. We'll have a look at which one makes the most sense. But to end off today, just a quick conclusion. So many scholars, not all scholars, but most scholars who are not apologists, people who want to defend their tradition, people who are critically coming at the subject, in other words, from a more unbiased situation. Because apologists, they approach this from everything in the Bible is what God said. Then they start studying it, and then they try and put it together. Where a critical scholar, could be a Christian or not, comes and says, what does the Bible actually say? What does it look like? And then we draw conclusions from there. It seems to be the consensus that 2 Thessalonians falls under the category of disputed books by Paul, where many believe that Paul didn't actually write this. It was an apologetic written about 50 years, plus minus 50 years later. We don't know by who, but it was written by someone that claimed to be Paul and claimed to correct and adjust some of Paul's teachings. And that's basically it. And that's why we're not going to go to 2 Thessalonians during the study of Paul's early writings. We're not going to incorporate it in, because the moment you do that, is it at hand? Was it at hand or wasn't it? You'll never know, and you can play it any way you like. But it seems to me to be quite clear that for early Paul, for Paul, the real Paul, the historical Paul, the coming of Jesus was the answer to all the world's problems. It was going to happen very, very quickly in his time before he died. And this was going to bring in a blessed, new, blissful kingdom on earth, in which God rules, only God rules, God is all in all evil powers and spirits have been dissolved, and they've been dealt with, and all that's left is humanity, immortal, to enjoy a blissful experience on the face of the earth. Okay. So saying all of that, the obvious question, and I'm not going to answer it, is, did Paul make a mistake? I think so. I think Paul's view of Jesus was influenced by his Jewish expectations, apocalyptic expectations. So, and this is the very earliest writings of Christianity that we have, and this is possibly why Christianity today is still an apocalyptic religion. We're all expecting the end of the world tomorrow. When it was 1980, we said 1988, 1983. We always got it wrong for the last 2,000 years. And those who are writing about it coming soon, they will also be getting it wrong, because that's a Jewish apocalyptic expectation, which has roots in strange places. And this might not actually be what God is busy with and what God is up to. So that's from a simple, slightly more unbiased view. That's what we're dealing with. So 2 Thessalonians, good to read for history, good to work through, to see, but be aware at least then of these differences. And the more you become aware of them, the more obvious they become. And after a while, they poke you in the eye and you just can't read past them. So thank you so much for being with us today. It brings us to the end of 1 Thessalonians. So next week, maybe Philippians, maybe Corinthians. We'll see
See.
how the wind blows. Have a
Awesome.
great week, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Bye.